So welcome everybody to this public meeting of the Socialist Labour Network, a meeting called Enough Silencing, Scrap the IHRA False Flag Misdefinition of Anti-Semitism. Now, this is a week that Laura Murray, a former Labour Party employee, was awarded substantial damages for an article written by Ian Austin MP and published in the Daily Telegraph. Ian Austin and Telegraph also apologised to her and stated that there was and is no basis to suggest that Ms Murray is anti-Semitic. However, not everyone falsely accused of anti-Semitism will reach a satisfactory conclusion. Many members of the Labour Party have been suspended, been given notice of investigation and or expelled based on accusations of anti-Semitism on extremely spurious grounds. This has been enabled by the IHRA so-called definition it is not, and enforced by the Labour administration. The definition is being used to silence speech calling out the Israeli apartheid regime. Academics and others are being punished for speaking the truth. And in particular, any development that's chilling for academic freedom. Many universities have fully adopted the misdefinition of anti-Semitism. Several have not done so despite government threats to freeze funding streams. In a letter sent to Vice Chancellors, Education Secretary Gavin Williamson said it was frankly disturbing that some universities had not adopted the IHRA definition and that they were dragging their feet by not doing so. The Union of Jewish Students website tracks the current sign-ups to the definition by universities in Britain. 98 in England have so far signed up to the definition, 4 in Scotland, only 1 in Wales and none in Ireland. The IHRA definition of anti-Semitism is dangerous to free speech and academic freedom. We call for it to be scrapped. We will hear this evening from a number of speakers distinguished in their field and who have encountered the definition in their work. Each will speak for around 10 minutes, Ramzy will for a little longer, and we'll take contributions and panel responses at the end. So we will now move to our first speaker. Professor Haim Bresheeth is an Israeli anti-Zionist, a research professor at SOAS, founder member of Jewish Network for Palestine, and the author of An Army Like No Other, A Critical History of the Occupation Army, published in August 2020 by Verso. We'll put some links in the chat so that you can see more about it. So Haim, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. First, I want to ask the question that was already answered. Can you see me?
Yes, we can see you.
Okay. What is the IHRA definition? It is not a definition of anti-Semitism. It is a definition of anti-Zionism. It is the crude and evil it is the crude and evil device of a racist settler colonial illegal occupation in Palestine, who has taken over genuine anti-racist territory, claiming it for the supporter of Israeli atrocities against the Palestinians. The British government, which had inaugurated and assisted the illegal Zionist occupation and settlement for over a century, is now parroting anti-occupation slogans against Russia. IHRA has been employed as a political virus using guilt by association, infecting and affecting the public sphere, the parties, parliament, media, judiciary, the undemocratic universities, and even some unions. This is used to strangle debate against the longest colonial occupation in modern times, but also to unseat a popular socialist Labour leader, to sack Tory ministers, and to unite the British elite in support of an apartheid regime hankering for a British imperial past. In this, like in all other areas, Britain follows the lead of the most powerful nation on earth, without whose support the colonial project in Palestine would be impossible. British zeal in supporting Israeli war crimes and atrocities against the Palestinians and the IHRA seems even more aggressive than that of the US. By adopting the IHRA working definition, the weaponized definition of anti-Semitism, supposedly, the UK separated Jews from others suffering inequality and racist discrimination in Britain, instead of supporting a united front against racism. All this is in the interest of silencing public debate on Palestine and serving Israeli hasbara. By passing regulations and legislation denying the right to disparage Israeli policies and support BDS, the UK government has singled out Israel as the only regime which may not be criticized and acted against. The range of measures enabling this travesty of democracy and free speech has become even more offensive in the light of Britain's leading the Western media chorus for BDS against Russia's incursion into Ukraine, a government which has done all it can to stigmatize and outlaw legal, non-violent, direct civic action against the brutal apartheid regime for many decades, has itself imposed severe sanctions against Russia less than a week into this war. By distinguishing occupation from occupation, racism from racism, just because our racists are better than theirs, Britain has itself acted in a racist manner. By treating Israel as representing all Jews, it has acted in an anti-Semitic manner, assuming all Jews to be supporters of Zionism, clearly a racist assumption. Most of the IHRA labor expellees, for example, are anti-Zionist socialist Jews, like Tony Greenstein, Diana Nestlin, Jackie Walker, Moshe Machover, Glyn Sacker, or myself. Others accused of anti-Semitism, bizarrely, such as Jeremy Corbyn or David Miller, are lifelong socialist opponents of racism and Islamophobia. We are united. We will not be the stooges of a militaristic apartheid colonial regime and will continue to struggle against its iniquities and injustices, even as the UK government and its cultural, media, military, and political elites confirm their century-old support of Zionism, defined as an apartheid regime by key civil rights organizations in Israel and elsewhere. When the West and its stooges support all Israel's action in Palestine and beyond, they shore up not only Israeli apartheid, but their own criminal occupations and massive destruction of many countries over many centuries, from Iraq, Syria, Libya to Sudan, Yemen, and Afghanistan. Such destructive illegal occupations, many lasting decades, echoing past crimes, are the indelible mark of European and Western imperialism and neocolonialism, slavery, and exploitation of the global South by the West. Their support for Israel rests on their colonial past and their current incursions, and on their attempts to control and deny democratic popular forces everywhere. Britain, which controlled over a third of the habitable globe and oppressed the widest variety of indigenous people, from China to Chile, from India to Palestine, from Kenya to North America, from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe, purports to teach moral lessons on racism by censoring and proscribing political solidarity with Palestine. Such perverse hypocrisy is rare in the annals of human history. All this to assist another brutal, illegal, and militaristic regime which expels, oppresses, and kills many thousands for the crime of being Palestinian. If the suffering of Ukrainian civilians is unjust, which it is, after 3 weeks of Russian attacks, what of the suffering by Palestinians after nearly 8 decades of occupation? Past racism of the British Empire rules again. One may attack the others of the West, the non-whites, non-Judeo-Christians of the global South, but not the white European Christians. We are not fooled by this government or by the British elite, ranging across the spectrum from Starmer to Johnson, from The Guardian to The Sun, from Sky News to the BBC. The denial of Palestinian rights serves the interest of those colluding in neo-imperial crimes of the Western Alliance and NATO. Western policies combine racist disdain, political denial, capitalist exploitation, cultural imperialism, class brutality, and environmental destruction, all under the corrupt veneer of legalistic democracy. We should make sure the IHRA fails to silence us. We should redouble our efforts to promote the BDS campaign in every way possible. As sanctions are imposed on Russian government after a week of war, let us remind the British public of this other, longer and brutal occupation of Palestine, and demand BDS action against the apartheid state. Our agenda is clear: end Zionist occupation and settlement, honor UN resolutions on the return of refugees, no to Zionist racism, no to settler colonialism, apartheid, and occupation. Our solidarity is with the Palestinian people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Haim. I think many of us have been sickened by the hypocrisy demonstrated in the current occupation and action in Ukraine, and the hypocrisy and racism both of our government and of the party. If you've questions for Haim, people in the audience, please do save those questions for later. We'll bring those questions together at the end. So now, I do have some hands raised. We're not going to be taking any questions right now. So unless there's something else that you want to raise with us, can you put your hands down, please? So our next speaker is Ramzy Baroud. Ramzy is a well-known Palestinian journalist and the editor of the Palestine Chronicle. He's the author of 6 books. His latest book is co-edited with Haim Bresheeth and is Our Vision for Liberation: Engaged Palestinian Leaders and Intellectuals Speak Out. It's available in the UK through Marston. Again, we'll put a link to it in the chat. Ramzy is a non-resident senior research fellow at the Centre for Islam and Global Affairs. We'll also put his website in the chat. So Ramzy, over to you. Welcome to our meeting. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And it's wonderful to be able to talk to many of the comrades. Some of them I saw in person in my various trips to the UK. Thank you very much for keeping Palestine at the center stage and constantly on your thoughts. Speaking of my trips to the UK a few years ago, that was during the height of the Jeremy Corbyn, supposed anti-Semitic crisis that was, happening within the Labour Party. And that's when friends of ours, one after the other, were kicked out of the party for supposedly being anti-Semitic. I remember giving a talk somewhere in Northern England, and there was a member who introduced himself as an associate of Mr. Corbyn and someone who said that he is helping him kind of manage his way out of this supposed, and of course, manufactured crisis. The way he explained it to me is that the Labour Party soon, he said, will be able to articulate a very strong position on anti-Semitism, and that will end the debate. It's going to be over. Everything is going to be okay, and we are going to kind of go back to business as usual. Of course, I couldn't help myself but kind of laughing and frankly out loud at this silly notion. And I explained to him that the idea of linking Palestine solidarity and a criticism of Israel as a form of anti-Semitism is not really supposed to be a point for debate that could potentially be sorted out. It is meant to be a point of perpetual distraction, of putting the onus on the Palestinians and the pro-Palestinian activists and anywhere in the world to supposedly take a stance on this issue and to cleanse themselves from the sins of the racist amongst them. And it's not a winnable battle. My argument then was, what about creating definitions for Palestine? What about Palestinians defining how they see things? What is the Palestinian right of return for Palestinian refugees? What is the Palestinian Nakba? What are the rights of the Palestinian people as enshrined in international law? What is the illegal Jewish settlements and the extremist Israeli Jews living in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and what they are doing? How about defining and making BDS definitions mainstream among British, European, American societies everywhere around the world as well? Why not take the initiative instead of constantly being caught in the corner of constantly having to define ourselves or defend ourselves, rather, defend our allies, and quite often actually kind of go amongst ourselves and try to cleanse our own movement. Of course, racists do exist in every society, in every movement, in every community. There's no question about that. But this idea that pro-Palestine communities and Palestinian communities around the world are the ones who are actually being held accountable for their perception of Israel and their perception of Zionism and their perception of Israeli war crimes and so forth and so on. That's a major problem. And I think it's a problem that goes beyond the IHRA definition, in the sense that even if we manage to slow it down, it's not going to go anywhere, by the way. It will always be there because it is a strategy. It's a strategy that is being used by governments and by states. I mean, here in the US last January, for example, 10 American states declared their full adoption of the definition. And that number is going to continue to grow. The State Department accepted that definition in the US in 2016, although they had been engaged with it since 2010 and so forth. So this is not going to go away. I think our alternative strategy is to push our own definitions. Now, remember, once upon a time, it was the Zionists who were in the defensive, not us, not the Palestinians, not the pro-Palestinian activist communities in Britain or anywhere else in that world. It was the Zionists. And they were in the defensive because the Organization of African Unity, which is the precursor of the current African Union, in 1975 gave us the true definition of Zionism and defined Zionism as a form of racism. And they linked that definition of Zionism as a form of racism to other existing racist apartheid regimes in Africa at the time. In fact, with all appreciation and admiration of B'Tselem, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and others for declaring Israel to be an apartheid state, African states and African communities have already reached that conclusion many, many years ago, decades ago. And not just that, they actually, through their lobbying with their Arab allies in the United Nations, with their Muslim allies, with their allies from the Southern Hemisphere, the global South, they actually managed to push that definition of Zionism as a form of racism also in 1975 in UN General Assembly Resolution 3379. And sadly, that resolution was revoked under immense American pressure in 1991. And since then, the Zionists weren't just satisfied with that incredible achievement. they have also tried to turn the table by creating their own definitions and holding us accountable to these definitions. So we have a serious issue here that needs to be sorted out, not just only dealing with the harmful effect of the manipulation of anti-Semitism and how it's applied, it's applied through the political discourses that now dominate Europe and the United States, and sadly other places outside of these entities, but also of the fact that we Palestinians are not able, or no longer able, to enforce our own definitions of anything. I mean, who is talking about the Palestinian people right of return right now? I mean, yes, of course, I'm sure within the pro-Palestine community in Britain, I am sure that this is being discussed in one way or another. But is it part of any relevant mainstream corporate media discussion or any discourse, political discourse on Palestine in any respected institution anywhere in the world? In fact, earlier I was in this extremely long Zoom conference in which Palestinians were complaining that even within the Middle East itself, we no longer talk about the right of return for Palestinian refugees. So we have two issues here, two parallel issues, and we have to work on these two issues simultaneously. When we need to revoke this politically manipulative definition that exploits a real and present problem of anti-Semitism, of racism against the Jewish people in a genuine way, but manipulates it by the Zionists and by Israel and misuses it in all of these political contexts in order for the Zionists and Israel to achieve yet another political objective. Yet on the other hand, we also don't have a serious Palestinian platform where Palestinian political discourses are made available, not within the Labour Party, not even during the Corbyn era. And I am sorry if I am offending anybody here, but this is really what I managed to glean out of that whole discussion that lasted for a long time. That while everybody is trying to defend Corbyn and others that they are not anti-Semites, there was very little efforts of actually recreating or kind of imposing a Palestinian definition or a Palestinian discourse on anything. And the other issue, of course, is to try to engage with Palestinians regarding their definition of so many issues. Earlier, our book with Ilan Pappé was mentioned, and I would love for you to all obtain that book and to engage in that conversation. What Angela Davis, when she was discussing the book and endorsing the book for us, she said, this is not a book, it's a project. So we need to all be involved in that project, because what it essentially is, it is 30 Palestinian essays, each trying to define one aspect of the Palestinian struggle, be it that of language, be it that of armed struggle versus popular struggle, be it that of the one state versus any other supposed solutions, be it that of art, cinema, archaeology, even history, and so forth and so on. We want that kind of Palestinian conversations, the book or any other Palestinian platform, to kind of start occupying the space. And I really think this is the best way to fight these kind of unfair definitions that the Zionists keep imposing on us. And for us to be on the offensive for once as to be constantly on the defensive. And one last thing, we need to remember that we have many allies in the global South that we tend to neglect quite often. And there are reasons for that, and I don't want to delve too much into that because I don't want to exceed the generous time that was allocated to me. But what I have noticed through my travel in various countries in Africa, in South America, in Southeast Asia, that there is some kind of a disconnect regarding the conversation pertaining to Palestine, even within the Palestine solidarity movement. And we need to change that. We need to remember that we are not fighting lonely fights, neither in the UK, nor in America, nor anywhere else. We are part of a global movement. And we need to constantly find that common ground. And we need to use the African experience in particular, because they were the champions of ensuring that Zionism for many, many years was recognized to be a form of racism. Thank you very much for hearing me out, and I look forward to listening to the other contributions as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. It's a really important strategy that we focus on things that we want and that we must do, rather than merely trying to dismantle or stop something else, positive action. And actually, an example of positive action is to be found, because we now have Huda with us. Huda is a Palestine activist who led the highly successful Palestine Action, which has recently succeeded in closing Albit's arms factory in Oldham. It's great to see you here, Huda. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to speak, and it's great to be amongst so many friends here as well and talking on such an important topic. So as some of you may know, I am Palestinian and Iraqi myself, and I grew up here in Britain. My great-grandfather was shot and killed by a British soldier during the British Mandate of Palestine shortly after Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, which essentially called for the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. Several decades later, in 1967, my own father, with his younger siblings, was being aimlessly shot at by the Israeli military whilst he was in his front room of his home in Palestine, and they had to escape by crawling through the back of their house with just the clothes they had on at that time, leaving behind their homeland and eventually making it away to Iraq. And this is not a unique story at all. In fact, every Palestinian you'll speak to has a story which roots back to Israel's military occupation and apartheid regime. But when I was growing up here, I grew up in a northern town in Britain, and I went to University of Manchester. And whilst I was there, I discovered that the university had ties to an Israeli institution called Technion, which was the leading research and development institute for Israel's arms trade. They also had several investments in companies like Caterpillar, who literally provides the Israeli army with bulldozers, which are weaponized and used to demolish Palestinian communities, demolish Palestinian homes, all in order to make way for the ever-expanding illegal Israeli settlements. And this was all in contradiction to their own socially responsible investment policies. And quite frankly, I was quite shocked and disgusted to find out that the university I was paying tuition fees towards was essentially spending that money on destroying my family's homeland in Palestine. And actually, when I looked further into it, I found out that this was something that was happening across Britain and across British institutions. Universities overall invest over 500 million into such companies, and pension funds invest billions of pounds into companies who are complicit in Israel's apartheid regime. And when I was campaigning at University of Manchester, we managed to gather quite a lot of support from not only students, where we passed the BDS motion at the Students' Union, but also from over 100 academics at that institution who backed these demands and wanted the university to end this complicity. But constantly, we would always hit the same obstacle. And despite presenting the facts, despite calling them out on their own policies, which said they couldn't invest in human rights violations, despite it being clear that this is violation of international law, etc., they wouldn't listen. And it became clear, that there was other interests at play here. And through freedom of information requests, we actually found out that the university had meetings with the Israeli embassy. So this is, a British university meeting with a foreign embassy, an apartheid embassy, to discuss concerns they had over their own students campaigning on these issues. And I think this is something which is just a kind of microcosm of a widespread issue across not only Britain, but across the world. And of course, the IHRA had a part to play in it, but I think it's just the latest manifestation of the same tactics that Israel and its supporters employ in order to silence Palestinian voices and to keep support for Israel's apartheid regime. One thing I would also say about the IHRA is that as Ramzy said quite clearly, is that it serves to silence the Palestinian voice. And also, when I was active in Labour during Corbyn's time, trying to push the arms embargo during this whole, Labour crisis of anti-Semitism, it seemed that the debate literally just took out Palestinian voices. And that is what the IHRA served to do. It served to take out the Palestinian voice and to exit us from this debate, even though it was about our own oppression and about us fighting for our own oppression. And this is quite clearly a tactic that they seek to employ. And I think this is something that we have to make quite clear, that actually we have to put the Palestinian story and what is happening to the Palestinians always at the forefront and not allow it to take out those voices. Because when it works in that way, then it can be quite effective, because it takes out what oppression Israel is facilitating and what these institutions are facilitating. So when I was in Labour, myself and many others actively campaigned for the arms embargo between Britain and Israel to be passed and to be on the manifesto, which it was in 2019. And a lot of us were extremely happy about that. And then obviously, as we saw, Corbyn obviously lost, and the campaign against him was successful. And it became quite clear at that point that although we had, myself and many others had tried so many ways of what is a very basic demand, to not supply military equipment to an apartheid state, which is going to use this against the Palestinian people. And what was such a simple demand was so hard to get through. And it became quite clear at that point that actually through the mechanisms and through the mechanisms that Britain provides to you to campaign for social justice, such as lobbying, etc., were closed off when it came to Palestine, and that wasn't going to work, and that we had to try something else. And for us, that meant taking direct action. And Elbit Systems, for example, is Israel's largest arms company, and Britain has been complicit in the colonization of Palestine for over 100 years, had 10 of these sites, several factories which are producing components and weapons that are literally marketed as battle tested on the Palestinian people, because Israel and Elbit Systems are using Gaza as a laboratory to test out these weapons. They are building them in front of us and then sending them and exporting them to other oppressive regimes across the world. So for us, it was about taking direct action and saying, if the government isn't going to issue an arms embargo, we will stop these weapons companies ourselves. And that meant several of us starting off by going into the headquarters of Elbit Systems in London, later on going on to occupy their factories, climbing onto their roofs and destroying their machinery and destroying their factories to make it impossible for them to operate. Because we knew that if they were able to operate, it was going to continue the oppression of the Palestinian people. And this is a concrete way that we can try and stop that material complicity with Israel's apartheid regime. And with that, not only does it put us on the offensive, so to speak, but it puts us on the forefront of this campaign, rather than being reactive to the tactics of the Israel lobby or to the tactics of the British state, etc. Actually, we need to be at the forefront and they have to react to us. And when we put the focus on this complicity, on Israel's arms trade, it becomes extremely difficult for them to try and attack it using these same tactics, because it exposes it for what it is, which is a political tactic to silence our voices. And I mean, if you try and use that when you're talking about the arms trade, it doesn't sit well with the majority of people, especially when we actually show through Elbit Systems, we can show the true face of Israel's apartheid regime, how they see the Palestinians. And literally in Gaza, they are treating them as a laboratory. I mean, it's the most sickening of business models that any company can employ. But this is how Israel operates. But with them having these sites here, it gives us an opportunity to sabotage it. It gives us an opportunity to stop it. And as you mentioned before, that was successful in Oldham. In January, after several activists over the course of a year and a half went in several times, blockaded the gates, climbed onto the roof, went inside and destroyed the machinery, matched with the local community mobilizing week in and week out, it became impossible for them to operate. And that's the type of success that we plan on replicating across the country, because many of us are sick and tired of appealing to the same powers that are so determined to actually keep listening to an apartheid state rather than listening to reason. And it becomes quite clear that persuasion, information, providing the facts is not enough when it comes to Palestine. And that for us, we are left with no roots left, but to take such action. And it's imperative that we do act with that urgency when it comes to Palestine. You know, Palestine has been occupied for over 74 years. And you know, we don't want to be here much longer campaigning on this issue. And that means that we have to ramp it up and escalate our actions in order to end complicity with Israeli apartheid. But we also have to act in solidarity with one another, to act in solidarity and not allow these attacks on activists to succeed. And when we do that, we make it impossible. We know the IHRA is passed by many institutions. It's going to be a very difficult battle to actually try and retract that. But at this point, it's about making it impossible for it to be enforced. And that whenever they do try and attack us, that we do fight back, that we fight back against the definition, we fight in solidarity with one another, and we fight to stop British complicity with Israeli apartheid.
Thank you so much, Huda. Like Haim calling out the hypocrisy, and with Ramzy calling for us to be proactive and to take action. Our next speaker will be known to you, Professor David Miller, one of the world's leading academic experts on Islamophobia, also specialising in the analysis of state and corporate lobbying, until his recent sacking by the University of Bristol, which resulted from an outrageous censorship campaign led by the UK's Israel lobby. He taught political sociology. He also set up the UK's lobbying watchdog, Spinwatch, which has tracked corporate power for 15 years. Spinwatch's work has included investigations on the pharmaceutical lobby, the fossil fuel and fracking lobbies, as well as state lobbies that promote Islamophobia, such as those of Israel and the United Arab Emirates. We'll put a link into the Support David Miller campaign. Thank you very much, David, for coming along this evening. Now over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Esther. Hello to everyone who's in the meeting. I just wanted to just follow Huda's fantastic talk there by highlighting a couple of things which Huda was too polite to mention, I suppose. But let's be clear: the campaign that Palestine Action have pursued has been an extraordinary success. It means that Palestine Action is the cutting edge of the Palestine solidarity movement in this country, and is showing the way for other Palestine solidarity organizations which they need, and it's clear that they need to catch up with this kind of a more combative approach that Palestine Action have taken. So I think all of us will want to congratulate Huda and everyone else at Palestine Action for the tremendous successes they've had, and many more to come, I hope. I wanted also to say something about Elbit. Of course, Elbit Systems has a number of different subsidiaries, one of which has been producing the Tavor rifle, which of course many people have seen in the hands of the Azov regiment in Ukraine in recent months and weeks. The involvement of the Zionists, the Israeli government and the Zionist movement in Ukraine is a matter which is quite extraordinary. I mean, there are Israelis traveling to fight the Russians with the Ukrainians. The Israelis have been supplying weapons. The IDF have been training the National Guard, including the Azov regiment, which of course is part now of the Ukrainians' National Guard. And of course, there are many others who have been recruited to the Ukrainian military from inside Ukraine who are Zionists. I see that the Secretary of State for Defense, James Heapy, just a day or so ago, admitted this, that there are Jews inside at the Azov battalion, the Azov regiment. We knew this was the case back in 2014. It appears to be, according to the Secretary of State for Defense, still the case. So there's an interesting parallel between the ideas prevalent in Zionism, the idea of self-determination for the Jews and only for the Jews, and the kind of ideas there are in Ukrainian nationalism. And just to go on about this for a second more, let's remember that effectively Zionism comes from the Ukraine. Odessa has been described as the gates of Zion. Jabotinsky, the famous revisionist Zionist leader, was from Odessa. Pinsker, also, who started the Lovers of Zion, one of the forerunners of the Zionist movement in the 1880s. So there's a strong connection between Zionism and Ukrainian nationalism, which goes back, more than 100 years. And it's interesting, isn't it, that therefore we also have not just that connection, but the direct involvement of the Israeli government and Elbit, for example, in supplying that side in the conflict. Now, let me come on to the whole question of the IHRA and how we fight it. The other thing which Huda didn't mention about Palestine Action is, of course, that they are now, because of their success, under direct attack from the Zionist movement. The JC have been doing attacks on them, as they have been on the rapper Loki, who has very prominently supported Palestine Action. So we should be clear that we need to defend Palestine Action, and indeed Loki and others who are attacked by the JC, by the Zionist movement more generally, because this is an attempt to take out people one by one. It's the same thing which happened to me. I was one of the people who was taken out. And let's remember also, of course, before this, Chris Williamson, another person taken out by this whole process. Now, it's interesting. I see that one of the things which is now being said to condemn people like Loki is that his crime is that he has supported in the past Chris Williamson and David Miller, two obviously terrible people who are obviously anti-Semites. And it seems to be just common currency that you can now say this kind of lies in the public domain, and you can use just the name David Miller or Chris Williamson to indicate that someone's obviously not a good person. And so they came for Chris, they came for me, they're coming for Palestine Action, they're coming for Loki, they will come for others as well. And we need to be able to stand up against that and to say, no, we will not be doing this. And that is a hard campaign to fight. Getting rid of the IHRA is part of that, but we need to be clear that what we face here is an attack by not just the government in occupied Palestine, but the Zionist movement more generally, meaning all of the Zionist organizations all around the world which are engaged every day in trying to marginalize Palestine solidarity work. And let me just say a word or two on the Zionist movement. It's not just the government of Israel, as it calls itself. It's that there are Zionist organizations in almost every country in the world. In this country, for example, there are many, many Zionist organizations. There are many hundreds of Zionist organizations who are dedicated to supporting the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, the continued settlement and in Sheikh Jarrah, in Silwan, and many other places. And these organizations are part of the way in which the government in occupied Palestine can continue to do the ethnic cleansing there. So we have a responsibility. The liberation of Palestine will be the act of the Palestinian people. But in terms of Palestinian solidarity, we have a responsibility in our countries to take on the ways in which Zionism expresses itself in the country. Of course, one way, as Huda has very eloquently put it, is in relation to the arms industry and the support for apartheid, which the direct support for apartheid which they supply. But of course, there are many, as I said, hundreds of organizations in this country which are Zionists, which are pushing this agenda all the time. And what we need to do, therefore, is to, one by one, dismantle these organizations. And that's perhaps a difficult task. And there are, as I say, many hundreds of these organizations. I don't think anybody, even in the Zionist movement, knows the full extent of these organizations. But they need to be dismantled. They need to be de-Zionized or dismantled and stop from functioning, because otherwise we'll have continual support from this country and from other countries for the continued ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in the whole of occupied Palestine. So I wanted to say something about that this is not just a question of PDS, of sanctions, and those kinds of things. It's also a question of taking on the Zionist movement in this country, in France, in Germany, in America, and wherever it exists. And it's not enough for us to just say, we're going to boycott this thing or that thing. We have to take on directly the infrastructure which continues to support the ethnic cleansing in Palestine, and that is the Zionist movement.
Thank you very much, David. I expect that many of us have been frustrated by the absence of coverage of the issue about the far right in Ukraine. It's another of those issues that goes alongside the hypocrisy of this government in the West regarding the war. I note what you say about taking on these organisations, and we do need to keep coming back to that in order to make sure that the Palestinian cause is understood. We're going to move now to our next speaker, who is Professor Farid Issac. He's a veteran of the South African liberation struggle and currently a professor at the University of Johannesburg. He's a board member of Africa for Palestine. Welcome, Farid, over to you.
Thank you very much for having me over. And greetings to all the comrades who are online and from South Africa. I'm going to be very quick in this, but I remember sadly another Labour Party. I remember the Labour Party of 30 years ago. I remember walking the streets of Britain with some of the giants of the Labour movement in the United Kingdom, struggling or identifying with the South African anti-apartheid movement. And for all of us throughout the world, who have been deriving a lot of inspiration from the left in Britain, I do want to say that we continue to watch developments with tremendous amount of sadness, particularly in party politics, and that is why it is quite heartwarming to be part of such a forum. Secondly, I'm not only a proud veteran of the struggle against apartheid, but also of our university, the University of Johannesburg, is arguably the first university in the world about 11 or 12 years ago that decided to cut off existing ties with Israeli universities and to not enter ever again into any kind of academic liaison or cooperation with an Israeli university. Subsequently, our university had been joined by several other South African universities, although the battle on that front continues. To come more directly to the IHRA definition. Now, I understand, and I go along with the idea that we need to shift the terrain of battle so that they aren't the ones who define it all the time. And yet, in some ways, the fact that that certainly in the Labour Party and in the British Labour Party or in British party politics and in a number of other European countries, such as Germany, for example, and then, of course, the United States. This particular declaration is being weaponized thoroughly. It is being weaponized against, of course, it's been weaponized against freedom of speech, but more particularly it is meant to cripple critique of Israel as a Zionist state. So, and so in some ways, I completely agree with the idea of focusing on a particular thing such as this in the context of its value that it has added to the struggle against Palestinian solidarity. Now, one interesting thing about this definition that was adopted about 8 years ago by the IHRA, I think it's a brilliant example of how the Zionist lobby have been able to really manipulate things successfully and then use what it declares as now a new fact on the ground, in this case an ideological fact on the ground, to use that then as a major weapon of bullying. So not only have they resorted to bullying people such as David Miller and other academics, but even inside the Zionist movement in order to continuously diminish the scope for any possible, I mean, I'm not saying it is ideologically possible, but any possible emergence of a softer form of Zionism. So interestingly, in this definition, I mean, it's a very short 40-word definition. And it's at a superficial glance, it's like quite innocuous at a very superficial glance. And at the same time, they succeeded in getting the majority of their plenary to vote on this particular 40-word thing. However, what that lobby sneaked in subsequently, not even through a plenary of the IHR, but of a particular committee on the, what they succeeded in sneaking in was a number of examples about what the definition is supposed to be articulating. But inside the IHR, a number of people said, no, we didn't vote on that. But by now, and all the example deals with, or most of the examples, the majority of examples deal with the protection of Israel as a Zionist state. It has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. But what was happening inside that movement is they managed to depict any internal disagreement about whether the examples were a part of the definition or not. They managed to shut up all of that in fear of their own characters and the drafters of this 40-word statement also being described as anti-Semites now. This is the extent of this red herring that they created, with all apologies to the left for the red in the red herring. The second point that I want to make, and I'll be very, very quick about this. You know, comrades, as I've been listening, I've been thinking increasingly about something, that there is nothing in the Zionist propaganda that is really about anti-Semitism. If you look at all the alliances that this movement had co-opted, whether it was on an ongoing basis in the European right wing, even in the case of Hungary at the moment, when, for example, the Polish Prime Minister's background on anti-Semitism was thoroughly exposed, it didn't prevent the Israelis from welcoming and befriending him. If you look at the strongest bastion of Zionist support in the United States, it's the Christian right wing with its deep roots in anti-Semitism. And so, in many ways, the struggle for Zionism had long since moved from the struggle against anti-Semitism. And so how do we continue to embrace the struggle of anti-Semitism without privileging that struggle, that it becomes just another form, another manifestation of white privilege or global North privilege throughout the world? This is the one challenge that we have, because just as decent human beings, we are opposed to any kind of phobias against people on the basis of their ethnic origins or sexuality or whatever. So this is the one challenge that I think we have, to embrace the struggle against anti-Semitism without elevating it to another manifestation of white privilege. This on the one hand, and on the other hand, continuous cautioning against how this is instrumentalized and weaponized, not to protect or to defend Jews or international Jewry, if there is such a phenomenon, but to prevent the Palestinians from actualizing their rights, including the right of return. This on the one hand, and continuing in this enterprise of ethnic cleansing on the one hand, and the hegemonizing of a Zionist discourse in support of international imperialism. And of course, I'm saying international is will be more than willing also to dump this particular state when it succeeds in getting all the other Arab states to do its bidding. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Farid. Those insights about what Zionism is actually about. I'm sure we'll pick that up in the questions later. So now we are moving to our final speaker before we move on to questions back to the panel, to Tony Greenstein, who's the first Jewish person to have been expelled in the so-called anti-Semitism witch hunt in the Labour Party. Tony is a long-standing Jewish anti-Zionist and socialist Palestine activist. He has a forthcoming book on Zionism, about Zionism during the Holocaust. Most people that know Tony will be able, no doubt, to elaborate with a long list of adjectives. It's good to see you here, Tony. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. I can't imagine which adjectives you're referring to. But yes, my main claim to fame is having been the first Jewish person to be expelled, not for anti-Semitism, but as part of the anti-Semitism campaign in the Labour Party, which of course was disingenuous and dishonest, to say the least. And there's one point which has never been really mentioned, which is that if the Labour Party had been anti-Semitic, if anti-Semitism had been a problem, then the Zionists would have done absolutely nothing about it, because Zionism has never had any objection to anti-Semitism. It's never fought anti-Semitism. The origins of Zionism as a Jewish movement, it was a reaction to anti-Semitism, certainly, a reaction in particular to the Odessa pogrom of 1881, was to say that you couldn't fight anti-Semitism. Why? Because it was inherent in the non-Jew, that non-Jews carried it around literally as a kind of virus, a virus which was incurable. And of course, if you have a disease which is incurable, why would you bother to fight it? You want to treat it as a palliative at best. And the person who founded political Zionism was Theodor Herzl. He wrote a book, The Jewish State, the Judenstaat, the State of the Jews, and he wrote, and this was in the middle of the Dreyfus affair, which convulsed France in the last decade of the 19th century. And he never even mentioned the Dreyfus affair in his book, and he barely mentioned it in his 4-volume diaries. And he said, and he wrote in his diaries, in Paris, I achieved, because he was a newspaper correspondent there for the New Free Press, which was a Viennese paper. He said, in Paris, I achieved a freer attitude towards anti-Semitism, which I now began to understand historically and to pardon. Above all, I recognize the emptiness and futility of trying to, quote, combat, unquote, anti-Semitism. And this was the Zionist attitude throughout. I mean, I'm always amazed. The Board of Deputies, which claims to represent British Jews, held its first anti-racist, inverted commas, demonstration in March 2018 against Jeremy Corbyn at the height of the so-called mural affair. The Board of Deputies has a long record of refusing to fight genuine anti-Semitism. The Battle of Cable Street in 1936, when 100 to 200,000 workers, Jews and non-Jews, came out to oppose Sir Oswald Mosley. What was the reaction of the Board of Deputies? It said, stay in your homes, keep your heads down, don't make yourself conspicuous. Most Jews who were working class then ignored them, and Mosley was smashed. He wasn't able to march through the East End of London, despite the best efforts of the Metropolitan Police. So the question is, why have they chosen anti-Semitism? I think part of the reason is because Jews do not actually suffer from anti-Semitism now. Anti-Semitism is a marginal prejudice. I mean, if you're black and you drive a car, you can be picked up for the offence of driving while black. If you're black, you can be deported by mistake as part of the Windrush scandal to the West Indies. Jews do not suffer this. They don't suffer economic or systemic or state oppression of any kind. So Jews, anti-Semitism is an easy form of racism, which it isn't. It's really a prejudice, which the ruling class and the establishment can take up. Because if you notice who it is who most supports the Zionists and Israel, it is the right wing. Tommy Robinson, the British fascist, made an appearance to a hero's welcome at the last Israel demonstration outside the Israeli embassy last May when Gaza was being attacked. But not only Tommy Robinson, Donald Trump, the most pro-Israel president there's ever been. He was also anti-Semitic. He used to tell Jews their real home was in Israel, and he couldn't understand why they weren't loyal to Israel. And you can go on. The most ardent pro-Zionist party in the German Bundestag is the neo-Nazi party, the Alternative for Germany. Whereas the other parties condemned BDS as anti-Semitic, the AfD wants to go one step further and actually make it a crime to support BDS. And the same is throughout Europe. It's the far right who support Israel and the far right who support Zionism. Why? Because Israel is their ideal example of an ethno-nationalist state. I mean, Richard Spencer, who's the neo-Nazi founder of the alt-right in America, he describes himself as a white Zionist. And to be quite honest, if you are genuinely anti-Semitic, and if you are a neo-Nazi, what is there not to like about Israel? Israel is the model example for neo-Nazis today. But what I say to people, and I've just come really from a Palestine Solidarity Campaign conference, which was an abysmal fare at best today, they have junked anti-Zionism. They are no longer an anti-Zionist group, and so whether I remain a member, I don't know. But I have to say that there are many people who say, well, we support the Palestinians, but we don't want to take a position on Zionism because Zionism means different things to different people. And I say, you cannot understand the operation of Israel today unless you understand the history of Zionism and where it came from. You have to have that basic understanding. Because, for example, in its attitude to anti-Semitism, I say I've just completed the book and it will be out hopefully within a couple of months. You would think that the Zionists during the Holocaust were the most avidly concerned people about what was happening to the Jews, but that's not true. The Zionists didn't want to know about the Holocaust. They claim today the Warsaw Ghetto as their own and try to make a comparison between the attacks that Arabs would make on the kibbutzim or the settlements and the attacks that the Nazis made on the Warsaw Ghetto. It's not true. They tried to pull their people out of the Warsaw Ghetto and said the real fight is in Palestine against the Arabs, not against the Nazis in Europe. And to their credit, Zionist fighters, Zionist partisans said, no, we are staying here. And we should never mistake individual Zionists, who often have what Marxists would call a fragmented consciousness, with the Zionist movement as a whole. I also have to say, and I say this to David because I do slightly disagree with you, the Zionist lobby gets its power from the British establishment and the United States establishment. We should never imagine that it is autonomous. Indeed, anyone who is a student or understands the history of the Board of Deputies of British Jews was actually an anti-Zionist body. It only had its first Zionist president in 1940. Prior to that, the Jewish bourgeoisie feared Zionism would undermine their position in Britain. And so they were anti-Zionist. And what caused them to come over to Zionism was the support of the British establishment for Zionism. They felt they could not come into conflict with their non-Jewish counterparts in the ruling class. And I think it's important for us to understand what Zionism is and what its role is, and not to inflate out of all proportion the Zionist organizations. They are dangerous, they are poisonous, we do need to combat them, but we do need to understand that where the IHRA, for example, comes from is from the establishment itself. In many ways, as Barnaby Raine said, Jews are useful pets, just as Jews in, say, Algeria were an intermediary people. They were favoured by the French because they could use them, and the population would react against the Jews who they saw as their immediate oppressors. So it is with Jews today. Jews today, in many ways, are used by the ruling class. And that is what anti-Semitism, of course, is about. But I'd just like very briefly, really, to focus on the IHRA, not IRA. Sorry for that slip. Now, I'm trying to bring it up on my screen, but the IHRA, I mean, it's illogical, it's incoherent, and it's contradictory. Anyone with an ounce of intelligence would be able to realise that immediately. So when someone, when was it Robertson, I think it is, I'll remember his name in a minute. He's a famous QC, a human rights barrister in Britain. He said it's not fit for purpose. There are 11 examples. And for instance, it says denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination. Well, the right to self-determination is the right of nations. The Jewish people are primarily of a religion. They're not a nation. And actually to say they're a nation is in itself anti-Semitic, because if Jews are a nation, they actually don't belong in Britain, for example. They should go to Israel. And that's actually the Zionist program, that Jews who live in other countries should go back to Israel because that's their real home. And you see in Ukraine today, for example, the Israeli state is busily trying to extract Ukrainian Jews from what's happening there now. But at the same time, they're denying entry now to non-Jews who are Ukrainian, and they're actually charging deposits of 10,000 shekels, approximately £2,500, to Ukrainians who are, if you like, half Jewish, but the wrong half, because they don't really want them to stay, because it undermines a demographic majority, because Zionism is always concerned about how many Jews are in Israel and how many non-Jews, because that's what a Jewish state is. A Jewish state is inherently racist. But there are other things in the IHRA which sometimes people don't like. For example, drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. And partly that is what my book is about. Now, I mean, some people will react instinctively.
Up soon, Tony.
Sorry, Esther?
Up soon.
Yes, by all means. Sorry, I know I'm probably going on. I mean, but this is an important point, because people compare other people to Nazis all the time. Putin is the new Hitler. It used to be Gamal Abdel Nasser, Nasrallah in the Lebanon. There are all sorts of new Nazis, but if you compare anything in Israel to Nazis, that is anti-Semitic. Well, I have to say, that's absolute nonsense. For example, Zev Sternhal, who was a child survivor of the Premysl ghetto in Poland, He wrote an article in Israel, Growing Fascism and Racism Akin to Early Nazism, and that was in Haaretz. And there are many other survivors of the Holocaust who made the similar comparisons, because they could see that the attitude to Arabs and Palestinians was exactly the same as the attitude of the Nazis to the Jews. I mean, for example, today, a very simple example is the favorite cry of Zionists and right-wing Israelis is death to the Arabs. And in Europe in the 30s, the favorite slogan was death to the Jews. And you see that comparison, I mean, death to a minority is a pretty extreme position, to say the least. You don't get that in Europe, by and large, but you do get it in Israel. You saw thousands of settlers in Jerusalem at the last Jerusalem Day chanting that. And when Palestinians objected to it, the police attacked the Palestinians. They didn't attack the settlers, of course, because it's a Jewish state. So what I'm saying is the IHRA is an attack on political speech, freedom of speech, and so on. And when it says that Jews are a collectivity, and then at the same time it says you can't blame Jews for what happened in Israel. Well, if Jews are part of the one nation and Israel is the nation state, then of course you can blame them. Of course you can hold them responsible. Can you not hold British people responsible for what happened in Ireland or in Iraq? It's a complete nonsense. So we are faced with a concerted attack of lies and dishonesty from our political opponents. But we have to be clear and understand that Zionism is a political ideology, but an extremely reactionary and racist ideology. And indeed, when Zionism first came on the scene, it was a minority in Jewish communities. It was seen as a form of Jewish anti-Semitism, and that's how we should understand it. Thank you very much, and I hope I haven't gone on too long.
Thank you, comrades. Some really good points about the suppression of thought and speech. Bearing in mind that we're currently in the throes of extreme war propaganda, and so putting the IHRA in context, we can see how, as you say, Tony, is that the Zionist lobby gets its power from the British establishment and the US establishment, and we find ourselves there in many respects at the moment. So this evening, we've heard about pushing our own definition of anti-Semitism. We've heard about the need to be proactive in our struggle for Palestine and seen some examples of how that can work. We've heard exhortations to understand what Zionism is actually all about, including its links with the far right. We've heard calls from David to dismantle those Zionist organisations. And we've also talked about cutting through and exposing the hypocrisy, as well as sadly hearing that the PSC appears no longer to be fit for purpose, is no longer anti-Zionist. So in the context of all those issues and what you've heard this evening, I'd like to take questions from the floor to put to the panel. If you want to address a specific member of the panel, then please do so. You can either place your question by putting it in the Q&A and indicate as to whether you want to put your question in person, and that's a preferred route because we can keep everything together. If you can't work out how to put something in the QA, then please do raise your hand. So we want to know whether you want to be raised as a panelist and be shown on the screen, or whether you'd like your question answered verbally and without your appearing on the screen. So over to you, all of you attendees. I'm just looking at the Q&A now. We've got question from Ron. Ron, if you want to put your question in person, can you raise your hand? If not, I'll put that question to the panel. So I can't see Ron. Ron is asking, what impact will the Amnesty International report issued on the 1st of February have on the discourse about Palestinian justice and rights, especially given Amnesty's reputation? Would any of the panel like to respond to that question from Ron? I can't see any of you with your, yeah, Farid, would you like to come there? Thank you.
I think that at some levels, one needs to look at the Amnesty report as a helpful instrument. It's a very, very helpful instrument, partly because it has the effect of tripping a number of the liberal kind of Zionist supporters. So I give that to them. On the other hand, I don't think that the anti-apartheid movement, I'm talking about now, the anti-Israeli apartheid movement, that we internally derive any legitimation from an entity like Amnesty International. I think that it is helpful to convert other friends to a more progressive position, but only to a more progressive position. As for us who are inside the solidarity movement, I think we've been there, done that, and it's useful to invoke it. I'm not trying to be cynical, but to invoke it for a particular kind of audience.
Thank you. Thank you. I think, Haim, did you want to respond as well?
Sure. Just to add to what Farida said, basically, what Amnesty has done is joined the queue of organizations, including Israeli organizations, which are quite important, like B'Tselem, who declared Israel an apartheid state. Well, we know that for at least 40 or 50 years, because there were books written about it and research done about it. But every stone adds to this wall, which is built around Israel and around Zionism. So it's useful, but not for us. What is very useful is that the UN is discussing this now and checking it, because as you know, apartheid is a crime. There is indeed a crime of apartheid that the UN has defined. So Israel can be actually inquired into for the crime of apartheid, which, for example, there is no crime that the UN has defined for ethnic cleansing. So Israel can't be held responsible for ethnic cleansing in the same way that it can be held responsible for apartheid. So let's see what the UN does with it.
Okay. Thank you, Haim. I think Ramzy has a response as well.
Right. I think Amnesty's report is extremely important. In fact, I would say it's a game changer. I mean, for many years, we have been going after Amnesty International in particular. Remember, they have the two main branches, one in London, one in the US. They have been inconsistent in the type of language that they have used. For many years, we've been asking them to start creating this moral equivalence between the crimes committed by Israel and between Palestinian resistance. And it was really such an interesting thing to kind of see that is paying dividends after all of these years. Amnesty International has about 2 million members. And they claim that they also have a network of about 5 million activists. And that includes numerous people within mainstream society in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere. So it's really, you are kind of penetrating right in the heart of the liberal progressive agenda within the Western world, and added to Human Rights Watch and to B'Tselem. And I am pretty sure that most of these statements were well coordinated. I don't think it just happened by chance that they all came out with the same conclusion within the matter of a year or so, or less even. So I think as far as us in the Palestine solidarity movement, within the BDS movement, it is now helping us create that legal literature that would allow us to go to the United Nations, to the UN Human Rights Council, which, by the way, there's a major debate going on within the UN Human Rights Council right now over this very issue. Now we have this literature that would allow us to go out there and say, we now have enough evidence to actually brand Israel with apartheid. And the moment you are branded with apartheid, and that is just happening and happening even faster than we anticipated, it is very, very difficult for that brand to be reversed. So this is a major loss for Israel within a group of, or within a community that more or less has always tried to find that kind of middle ground between Palestine and Israel. We should definitely utilize it and use it and push it. And that becomes one of our new definitions that hopefully we'll be able to do to push against the unfair definition of the IHRA.
Yes, thank you, Ramzy. I mean, of course, the United Nations has been critical of Israel for many, many years. Who are you suggesting would be taking that action to push that legal agenda against Israel?
Well, I mean, Palestine has many friends within the Human Rights Council, UN Human Rights Council. And my assumption is that if that definition is adopted, it will start within the Human Rights Council before it is pushed to the General Assembly. So this is why, back to my initial point, we need to lobby within our friends and allies within the Global South. I know that there's a new organization. I think Fareed might be involved in that as well. The Pan-African Palestine Network. There are other organizations that are also building their own momentum in the Global South. We can't afford to lose African countries, Asian countries, and South American countries that have always stood in solidarity with Palestine at various international institutions within the United Nations General Assembly, notwithstanding. And I think it's these countries will keep pushing for that sort of definition once more in order for us to finally kind of, put Israel back on the defensive instead of us being constantly on the defensive. And just one very, very quick thing I would like to say. And I know that today we are here to talk about a very, very specific issue, so maybe we are excused in doing so, but I notice that quite often when I'm speaking within European societies, Austria, the Netherlands, definitely Britain, but other countries as well, quite often we could be talking for literally for hours, and we wouldn't actually be talking about what's happening in Palestine itself, because we are kind of engulfed in this, Zionist agenda. It's as if the Palestinian agenda itself now being controlled by a Zionist discourse without us realizing that we are playing well into their hands. So we need to break free from that and start actually, when we need to talk about Palestine, actually talk about Palestine.
Thank you. Yeah, very good point. That going on and on endlessly about IHRA rather than being proactive in favour of Palestine, as we talked about this evening, where it may well be counterproductive. I'm going to bring in Neil Todd now. I know that Neil's in Australia and it's probably like some unearthly hour. So Neil, I'm going to ask you to join the panel if you'd like to put your question or make your point.
Hi.
I'm just promoting you to the panel now. Hello.
Okay.
Carry on, Neil. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I don't know if you can see me, but yeah, I want to thank all the speakers for an excellent meeting. It's great to hear from around the world, Palestine, South Africa, and so on. I myself am an academic based at the University of New South Wales and a member of the National Tertiary Education Union, which is the sister union of the UCU. I was formerly a member for 20 years at the University of Manchester, my last employer in the UK, so I'm very much well aware of the awful record of the senior management at Manchester. The case of Palestine is one which is dear to my heart, given that my father served in Palestine at the end of the mandate and was a witness to the horrors of Zionist terrorism and was literally witnessed the ethnic cleansing of Haifa and other atrocities. So, and he had a lifelong loathing of Zionism. my main point is, I think, yeah, that the problem with the IHRA and its imposition is one which is a global one. It's because around the world, not least here in Australia. Some people may be aware of the case of Dr. Tim Anderson. He was a senior lecturer in the Department of Political Economy at the University of Sydney. He was sacked in 2018 following a complaint by the Australasian Union of Jewish Students. So it's some parallels with David's case. He in his lecture, he was making links between Zionism and Nazis, and this was, just another example around the world where the pernicious influence of Zionism is having its influence. I think that, yeah, it's something that the campaign needs to take up is to really look around the world and see it as an fully international problem. The case of the Israel lobby here is very similar to the UK, not just in the students, but in various other Zionist organizations, including the Board of Deputies in Australia and so on. Same with the Labour Party. The Australian Labour Party the Zionists have a kind of vice-like grip on Labour in Australia, so there are direct parallels there. So perhaps the panel could comment on these issues around the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Neil. Good to see you. Well, not quite see you, but I'm glad you're here. Yeah. Would any of the panel like to respond to Neil? Please start your video if you would like to. Oh, Haim. Yes. Carry on, Haim.
Right. First of all, Neil, you're right about the urgent need to do that. The only country where this is done well and extremely efficiently is surprisingly the United States. A number of organizations, but especially the Jewish Voice for Peace, which is an anti-Zionist organization, has done a lot to discredit Israel in the Jewish community, and not to mention the rest of the US community. And we in Britain, a number of us were members of the Jewish Voice for Peace in the United States because we couldn't join any organization with the word Jewish in it in Britain that was doing something similar. In 2018, we have created a sister organization called Jewish Network for Palestine in the UK, and we now have close on 800 members and followers. This is nothing compared to the many tens of thousands of JVP, but they also started small and we are growing. So I think we are using that model of being involved with young Jewish people and explaining to them what they are supporting, and they are supporting it without thinking about it. They were born into it, and removing them from that community of chorus for Zionism is very important because you're talking about the future. The other thing I wanted to say is that there are certain very toxic organizations. David mentioned there are hundreds of Zionist organizations. There are indeed, and they are charities, or at least I don't think none of them is charitable, but they are registered as charities. So anything we can do to undermine their charitable status, and a number of us are working on a number of organizations. I'll just mention Lawyers for Israel, who is actually involved in all the accusations we heard about tonight and many others that we didn't. And of course, the CAA. We are trying to see if the Charity Commission will look at those organizations, including the JNF, which is basically, not far from being a charity. It is actually financing the settlement procedures, and it is a racist organization from the beginning. from 100 years ago, no, more than 100 years ago, 118 years ago. So we're trying to do that, but I have to say the Charity Commission in Britain is so in the pocket of the Board of Deputies and other organizations that this is going to be very difficult.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I can see that there's a question actually that's linked to this, that the response made by him there, that maybe we can pick up. Question from Anne in the Q&A: how do we work to dismantle Zionist organisations? So Haim's already given an example of appealing to the Charity Commission, notwithstanding that it's likely not to be very receptive. But Anne's asked, well, how do we work to do that? And what are the primary targets if we are looking to dismantle specific organisations? Would any of the panel like to respond to that, given that was one of the things that David said we should be seeking to do? Any responses from the panel on that question from Anne? And following on from what Haim's already said.
I mean, I'm quite happy to.
Go ahead, Tony.
I can't unmute. I can't take the video off.
Okay, you'll just have to.
Oh, you now,
then.
yeah.
We
Thanks.
can hear you. We can't see you. There you are. Okay.
Okay, yeah. I mean, the Charity Commission is, of course, a problem because I mean, it was run. I mean, the last chairperson, William Shawcroft, was an out-and-out Islamophobe. I mean, he was a racist, and so the Charity Commission, I think, over a third of its investigations were into Islamic charities as a result of complaints by Zionists. I mean, that's the nature of the Charity Commission. It isn't independent. It's really a sub-department of the Home Office. It's what you call a non-governmental organisation. Now, how do you tackle it? Well, it may well be that we need some direct action against it. There was a picket, I think, in the giving in of a letter to the Charity Commission, which is, I think, near Victoria, but someone may correct me if I'm wrong. And there are 2 or 3 other offices throughout the United Kingdom. But the Charity Commission will not be tackled legally, because every time you try to tackle it legally, the tribunal says you have no standing, because if you don't have an interest in it, then you don't have the right to take part in court proceedings. I mean, in 2014, I was one of the petitioners against the JNF, but they decided I didn't have any standing, and everyone else, even though the JNF holds its lands in perpetuity for the Jewish people. So I said I was one of the Jewish people, but the judge didn't buy it for some reason. This is mythical entity of the Jewish people doesn't amount to very much when it comes down to it, because of course it is a fiction, isn't it? It's a racial supremacist organisation. So I don't know. Huda probably has some ideas about direct action, but I suspect that might be quite a good target, because you know, I mean, it is giving charitable status to. I mean, the CAA. I've made umpteen complaints about them. I took them to court for libel. You know, I mean, the High Court upheld them. It was an outrageous ruling, but a whole series of rulings. But the establishment protects them because it's in their interest. The alliance with Israel. I mean, Israel is the West's watchdog. It's guard dog in the Middle East. And so they will be very protective of them. And they'll do it under the guise of anti-Semitism. But we know, of course, that it's nothing to do with anti-Semitism. But I suspect that the Charity Commission needs to have a focus on it. Because at the moment...
Yeah, okay, so I think Huda may well be saying something else about a more direct form of taking action on this. But anyway, we'll hear what Huda has to say on this point. Thanks. Huda, over to you.
Thank you. It's a difficult question, because I always think very practically. This is how my brain works. But I think it's one that actually needs a lot of thought. Obviously, for us at Palestine Action, there are 9 sites of Elbit left, so that is our main focus. And for us, we're very much agreed that we want to get rid of them as soon as possible. And we saw the victory in Oldham, and we know it can work. And the more people are willing to take direct action and take that step, the quicker it will be. I think the time limit of Albert's existence left in this country is really set by us and how many people come on board to take this type of action. But aside from that, I think when we look at the Zionist organizations and how they operate, I think any direct action or campaign needs to be, we need the research, we need to see what they're sponsoring, the different events that they're taking part of, and how we can make the biggest splash and get the messaging right. Because as we know, that is one way that the Zionist lobby works. It's to attack, it's to try and change the narrative. So we have to make the narrative very clear. Obviously, with a charity commission, it gets more complicated. So we have to work that out carefully. But I definitely think that as we move on and progress in our campaigns and get to a point where we have tried, I think between us all, not just the panelists, but the people listening in, etc., we have tried many different tactics, and we are at a point where direct action seems the most viable tactic, not just in terms of the arms trade, but widely when it comes to complicity with Israeli apartheid. So I definitely think that we have to look more into it. And I won't say any specific plans on here because we don't have any yet, but I'm sure that there are definitely things that can be explored and different avenues to take.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. So I've got another question in the Q&A from Terry Harper. Could the panel comment on the application by Israel to become an observer in the African Union and to gain accreditation? I wonder whether Farid or any of the other panel might want to respond to that. Thank you.
I'll have a quick go. The African Union has some, it was the use of a very limited leeway given to the Secretary General, who is, of course, well, I dare to say in this case, with some certainty, is in the Israeli pocket. And he, on his own, took this initiative, and which was contrary to the charter of the African Union. South Africa, it's not often that I'm proud of any country, so even out of mine, but South Africa in this case did a great job in leading the campaign to ensure that this wasn't going to actually materialize. And at the last meeting of the African Union, that was in early December, the African Union decided to not implement the Secretary General's recognition. Unfortunately, South Africa wasn't able to muster, it did muster about 27 of the votes for a more radical decision to nullify the Secretary General's administrative action to give Israel access to the AU as an observer. And so instead of nullifying that decision, it reached agreement that, that at the forthcoming summit of the AU that should be happening in the next month or so, a final decision would be taken. So that's how far we have come. And I think it's, I don't know, in this respect at least, the South African Department of International Relations and Cooperation, that's our Foreign Affairs Department, they've done a pretty good job in terms of making this a foreign affairs priority. And so a number of diplomats and so on have been sent to other African states. And as usual, I mean, the United States in return, not Israel. Israel has minimal diplomatic leeway in South Africa, but the United States has made a number of threats behind the scene to try to cripple the South African diplomatic attempt. And just a quick one, the new Director General of Foreign Affairs in South Africa is a prominent, active, and ongoing supporter of BDS.
Good, good. Okay. I think, thank you very much, Farid. I think Ramzy wants to pick up on that question as well. Thank you, Ramzy.
Exactly, and thank you for that. Just a little addition that there's a very important context that we need to keep in mind, and it goes beyond the African Union and goes beyond whether Israel is allowed to maintain its observer membership status or not, and that is that there is a diplomatic and political and economic war that is underway in Africa at the moment. And Israel's charm offensive against Africa began years ago with Benjamin Netanyahu. In fact, in various elections campaigns, Netanyahu had made a claim that he was really more or less the one who is, has won Africa back after Africa has adopted a pro-Palestinian, pro-Arab position back in the day in the 60s and 70s. And sadly, we have been seeing a reversal of that position. And in some sad way, you feel like, well, can you really blame them when the Arabs themselves are normalizing? But in a sense, we also can, because it's a moral issue and it's a legal issue that goes beyond what Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Sudan, and Morocco have done. So we have to keep that in mind. And that's why, and I've written extensively on the subject of how Israel is trying to penetrate Africa and how Israel is dumping so much weapons in Africa as well, and that kind of really gives us a mutual platform with our African comrades, sisters, and brothers in the continent, in the sense that in many of these African polities, the weapons that are being used to suppress them and the tactics that are being used to oppress them are the same as the weapons and the tactics that are used to oppress and suppress Palestinians. So I think that we should pay attention to what's happening in the African Union, but remember, this is just really a microcosm of something that is much, much bigger. There's a new scramble for Africa involving Britain, involving France, particularly France in West Africa, the United States and the African Command, also Russia and China, and Israel is planning to be a very important major player in the continent, using its various so-called security technology to win African governments to its side. And sadly, the Palestinian leadership has very little to balance that out with, and that's why we are hoping that our allies such as Algeria, Nigeria, South Africa, and others come to the help or to our rescue until the Palestinians develop their own strategy in the continent. This is a very critical subject, and we should be paying a lot more attention to in coming months and years.
Well, thank you, Ramzy, and thank you for raising that, Terry. It's interesting, isn't it, that we have the ventures into Africa at the same time as we see the Israel influence in Ukraine. Very, very interesting and important as to whether there's a far-right agenda there too, and also how that links with the earlier discussion about potential legal challenges on the apartheid front. So some very important threads emerging there. I do have a question that Tony has said he will answer from Jack about Judaism, whether Zionism is actually changing the direction and ethos of Judaism. Would you like to answer that, Tony, please? Thank you.
You cannot start your video.
Okay.
Can you see me now or no?
No, we can hear you though.
All right, okay.
It just takes a while. Okay.
I am, okay. Yeah, I mean, Jack's question was whether Judaism today is really the same as it was 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, and the answer is no. I mean, no religion remains the same. I mean, people today will look back to what they consider the golden age of their religion and pretend that it's timeless because, of course, God himself or herself is timeless as well. But that's simply not true. The Jewish religion reflected the existing societies. I mean, when Jews were traders, primarily traders, moneylenders and so on in the Middle Ages, because they were a caste, the religion reflected that. When Zionism came about in the late 19th century, the most vehement opponents of it were the Orthodox Jews. Agudat, which is now in, or has been in the Israeli government, was formed to oppose Zionism. It was an ultra-Orthodox group which said Zionism is a form of nationalist heresy. It worshipped the land. God has exiled us, and only God will return us, and you're trying to do the work of God. But of course, the Israeli state was established, and therefore religious Jews who'd gone there found it was beneficial. But also, Zionism deliberately used the language of religion. It adopted the Star of David, which was an ancient, albeit very minor, Jewish symbol, in order to cloak itself, if you like, in religious garb. And it proceeded onwards. But part of the problem today is the most racist and reactionary sections of the Israeli Jewish population are the religious settlers, without a doubt. I mean, you had in 2009 a book which was written by two Lubavitch, which is a Hasidic group, called The King's Torah, or Torat HaMelech. And this was a book which was aimed at instructing people how you could kill non-Jews legally, including children and infants. And it said the wicked king, how you can hurt him, it goes back to the biblical tales, of course, was by killing his children. And this was accepted. And when the book came under attack, hundreds of rabbis defended it, and the Israeli state refused to prosecute. Of course, if a Palestinian or an Islamic scholar had brought out a book in Israel, How to Kill Jews Legally, according to the Quran, their feet wouldn't have touched the floor. They'd have been in prison for quite a number of years, because that's the racist nature of the Israeli state. But no, the Jewish religion has changed, and all the worst aspects are now coming to the fore. Aspects in the Talmud which had been buried, which had been forgotten, which had been left aside, which had been denounced. But today, of course, what was cast asunder 2 centuries ago is now really legitimizing the very worst aspects of Zionist colonization in Palestine, because the religious settlers, and I'll give you just one example, for example, the traditional Orthodox forbids Jews to go onto the Temple Mount, which is where Al-Aqsa Mosque is. And the reason they do that is because you might accidentally go into where the high priest was, the Holy of Holies. The high priest used to meet with God there, if you're religious, and I'm not, but according to their myths, that was where God was present. But the religious settlers have no compunction about invading Haram al-Sharif, etc. So that's an example. There's actually notices on the entrance to the Temple Mount, which says Orthodox Jews should not go here because you may accidentally trespass on God's pastures, and that would be a terrible sin. But for the religious settlers, that's of no use. I mean,
So,
yeah, sorry, I can go on about.
yeah. I think
My dad was a rabbi,
getting
that's
off the
why. You
topic. But those are very good points. Let's see if Haim can return to this topic. Over to you, Haim.
Right. Difficult to follow you, Tony, but 2 points. Of course, everything that Tony said is not only true, but very important. The moment that Zionism starts becoming active widely at the end of the 19th century, Herzl, the father of political Zionism, as he's often called, was talking about a state for the Jews. This is a translation of the name of his book. This was later translated into a Jewish state. So this is where the change happens. And of course, in order to have a Jewish state, you need Jews, and Jews did not come to Palestine. just one figure. In each country in Europe, the Zionists were less than 1% of the Jewish population. In some cases, much less than 1%, until the beginning of the Second World War. Now, the minute that you are actually giving the rabbis the decision on who is a Jew, for example, because whoever is a Jew is allowed to live in Israel. Now, the rabbis, until very recently, actually were strict about who can be called a Jew. Normally, someone whose mother was Jewish. So they agreed with the Nazis on those. The Nazis actually used the Jewish halakha to decide who is Jewish. But the rabbis, of course, been Zionized. So now, if you're, one of your grandmothers or grandfathers was Jewish, you are Jewish. Now, this is exactly what the Nazi 1935 legislation in Nuremberg said. So not very surprisingly, they adopted the Nazi legislation to define who is a Jew. So this is another example of what Tony is talking about. And I just want to end by saying that in the United States, there is an institution of research called the Pew Institute, and they actually do an annual or biannual survey of Israeli Jews and American Jews. And they have proven that the year before last, in 2020, more than 50% of Israeli Jews are either religious Orthodox or religious Reform, or what is called Masorti, which is, traditional. Now, you have to understand also that the ultra-religious have huge families. To have 10 children is not unusual. To have 2 children only is unusual, because like Catholics, they don't believe in birth control. So it's very easy to see that in about 10 years, there will be no political solution that can depend on Israeli Jews. There is no point waiting for Israeli Jews to decide to give anything to the Palestinians, because what also Pew proved, that the views of religious Jews in Israel about democracy and about human rights are totally negative. In other words, about 90% of religious Jews are against any rights to the Palestinians, are against having any Palestinians in Israel and any Palestinians in Palestine, because they see the whole country as theirs. If God, they of course know God personally, and God has promised this to them, so they demand it. So I think we need to think, in South Africa, the whites were a small minority. And that's very important to understand and remember. In Israel, they are trying to produce Jewish majority. At the moment, the Palestinians are a majority in Palestine, that is between the river and the sea, a small majority of something like 0.7%. So the state is trying to get, that's why they want people from Ukraine, Jews from Ukraine to come, Jews from Russia. They are making already the calculations about those. So remember that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Haim. I'm going to ask each of the panelists if they wish to make a final summing up statement or contribution. Since you're on the screen, Haim, do you want to say your?
Well, I've had a lot of chances to say what I think. I just want to say one thing. Huda has told us that we should not be reactive. Well, a number of the speakers said that. We should not be reactive. I think that's the most important thing to remember. So it's not about IHRA, stupid, yeah? It is about Palestine. It's about the rights of Palestinians. It's about the end of the occupation. The IHRA, well, I'm now in 3 universities defending people who are, at a hearing because supposedly they are anti-Semitic. I have to do it. We all have to do it. But that's not the main thing. The main thing is, do not forget Palestine. Do not stop talking about Palestine. Do not stop acting for Palestine.
Thank you, Haim. I think we have throughout this meeting been moving firmly towards that conclusion. We'll move on to Ramzy now. Would you like to make some summing up comments, please, Ramzy?
Professor Haim kind of basically summarized my point. And I am so glad that you say that we are kind of achieving this kind of more or less collective understanding that this ought to be the conclusion. But I would even take this a little bit further and say, let's not become too isolated in our discourses. Sometimes I feel that we have these kind of inner conversations, and at the end of the day, we end up reproducing the same political discourse more or less. We have to connect to the various aspects of the Palestinian solidarity movement globally in order for us to be part of, not just part of a larger conversation, but to be part of that proactive, that forward thinking, that initiative taking, and understanding of how we should be pushing Palestine into the the conscience of humanity. And I think there's so much that we can be proud of things that we are changing, whether using social media or the kind of statements that are coming out from new allies that we are creating in every platform. There is so much to be excited about. There is so much to look forward to. It's very, very important, though, that we kind of remain unified around the leadership of the Palestinian people, their intellectuals, their communities, and their spokespersons, who are now more or less kind of like making their voices heard, from Sheikh Jarrah to Gaza to even Haifa and Yafa. We know who they are, we know who these young people are, and it's so very important that we start listening to them and kind of getting their guidance on what ought to follow in the coming months and years.
Thank you, Ramzy. So connect and organize. Huda, would you like to comment now, please?
Yes, I just want to start by thanking everyone for coming and listening to us speak, and to the other speakers, and I agree with all of the previous summing ups. But I think I would just end on saying that when we are campaigning, I think we need to be, and I think everyone's in a kind of agreement in this, we need to be working together a lot more, and we need to be strategic and focused in our campaigns in every aspect of campaigning for Palestine. In the countries and the places that we are in, we need to have a strategy across the board, and be working together on that, and we need to stay focused in our campaigning. And obviously I'd like to ask people to support Palestine Action, to join us if you feel able to. All of the information is on our social media, and I'll send some links, and if you can donate, please do. We always need some money. But again, I think we are in one of the biggest fights for social justice. And actually, we have shown through our campaigns that we have the ability to be on the forefront and to be effective in our campaigning. And we need to ramp up now and act with the urgency that the Palestinians deserve.
Thank you, Huda. Solidarity, we can and we will fight. I don't know whether David is still here. I had a note that David might need to leave early. It looks as if David isn't here. So we'll go now. Oh yeah, you are here, David. Do you want to do your summing up, please? Thank you.
I had to go, but I've come back.
Okay.
I'm just looking through some of the comments in the chat. I mean, I haven't got very much to say, apart from to say that that the liberation of Palestine, as I said before, will be the act of the Palestinian people. But there is a lot that we can do in this country to support that process, both in terms of directly supporting resistance in Palestine, but also supporting resistance here to Zionism. I mean, I think that's the most important thing we can do, is to tackle the existence of the Zionist movement in this country, which ideologically, practically, in terms of money and resources, is supporting what's happening day by day in Palestine. Just one example out of very, very many is the UK Friends of the City of David, which is a UK charity which is sending money directly to the settlers and ethnic cleansers in Sheikh Jarrah. That's an organization which, by any measure, shouldn't exist. And yet it does, it's a charity. And there are many, many more, again, hundreds of charities that are engaged in similar sorts of activities, sending money and resources to Palestine to undermine the resistance there. So I think that, there's lots we can do here. There's a lot of organizations that we should be targeting and trying to close down one by one if necessary.
Thank you very, very much, David. That's very useful and important comment. Thank you. Farid, are you still there? Would you like to sum up, please?
Yes, I am. Well, very quick, I don't want to really summarize, except to say that I'm very grateful for the insights that people delivered, the other panelists, and from the questions, very, very grateful for it. I feel inspired in a renewed way. And I'm particularly grateful for the ongoing intellectual and activist insights that are provided by people like Ramzy and Huda. And yeah, I was particularly moved by the insights and the knowledge, the commitment of, and I don't want to stereotype people, of our comrades who come from Jewish backgrounds. So thank you very much for having me. And I also like the conviviality and large-scale convergence, I think, of people on the panel.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, sure. Yeah, thank you very much, Farad, for joining us. And finally, Tony, final comments from you?
Yes, I was going to say my video again is right. Thank you. I think the first thing really is we should remember this is held, well, 2 days before UN Anti-Racism Day, which was established, I think it was 1966, because of the Sharpeville massacre in South Africa 5 years, I think, before 1961. I may have got 1 year wrong, 1960, something like that. So we should remember that. But there's been many, many Sharpevilles in Israel. I mean, possibly the most outrageous was the use of Israeli snipers on the Great Return March in Gaza. They killed 300, but they injured thousands. And they did it with dum-dum bullets, which caused the maximum damage. But I think we should be, and I'll take up what Ramzy said, is the reports of B'Tselem, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch were extremely important. I think we are certainly winning the narrative, and it's precisely because of that that the only thing the Zionists can say is you're anti-Semitic on the basis, really, I mean, the reason Palestinians struggle and fight is not because they don't like their homes demolished or their kids imprisoned and tortured, but because they don't like Jews. I mean, it's complete nonsense, but that really is the only weapon in their armory. So it's absolutely right. Yes, we should focus on what's happening to the Palestinians. But I issue one word of caution. That's exactly what the Palestine Solidarity Campaign did. It ignored the anti-Semitism offensive until it caught up with it. So we shouldn't counterpose the two. The IHRA is a weapon in the hands of the Zionists. And if someone comes at you with a weapon, you have to disarm them. You can't just ignore it because you may die. And it's the same with the IHRA. We have to tackle the hypocrisy and actually the racism inherent in that definition, whilst, of course, we're Palestine Solidarity activists. So I echo entirely what Huda said. We should be supporting Palestine action. And I have to say that you don't have to be able to leap over barbed wire and climb onto roofs. Because, I mean, I was arrested literally a year ago as the getaway driver for those who were going into the factory. In fact, we were all nabbed before we got there, unfortunately. But even if you're disabled, and even if you're like me in your late 60s, then you still can do things. You can drive, you can contribute, you can raise funds, you can do all sorts of things. You can stand outside the factory and actually mobilise people in the local community, as it happens in Leicester and happens in Oldham. So there's a lot people can do, unless you're on your deathbed, when I'm afraid that's it. But apart from that, we can always fight and we can always struggle, and lots of continue. The struggle is eternal. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. We all continue in the struggle. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for coming to this meeting and presenting this evening. There's been a great deal of very useful content and a great deal of consensus on what we need to do. I've got just a couple of announcements to make before we all go. The details of the next public meeting of the Socialist Labour Network about disability have been posted in the chat. That's on the 25th of March, and you'll all be welcome. And there's also been a post in the chat by Brian, I think, about a Unite meeting about charges of anti-Semitism. We'll follow up by sending out some of the important links in the chat to people who attended the meeting. So thank you all. Solidarity and free Palestine. Good night, everyone.